What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Tuesday, July 9th edition of the Ship My Money Show Tournament Edition. Taking a look at tonight's currently 10-game slate, probably going to be 9-game slate by the time this slate starts. This is the new show that I'm trying out. Yesterday was the first episode of it, and we got a scratch as the show started. So today's already off to a better start. But it's going to be a tournament-specific, DraftKings tournament-specific show. DraftKings because it would take me twice as long and to prep, and the show would be twice as long if I did FanDuel as well. The strategies that I'm going to talk about, obviously, you can apply to FanDuel also. The specific players and teams are DraftKings specific, but just taking a look at what my set of 50 lineups in the large field, $15 or $18, whatever it is, tournament on DraftKings would look like if the slate started right now. Obviously, we don't have all the lineups. This stuff is going to change for me. I'm going to rerun everything between now and lock, but this is what I would be playing if the slate started right now. So I think it's an opportunity for me to hopefully catch mistakes that I would make. And also it gives me a chance to just talk through everything, make sure it makes sense to me, but also hopefully you guys pick up on some stuff as well. If you are interested in more in-depth strategy, more in-depth theory, stuff like that, check out the link in the description below for Endgame Syndicate. That's the new site that I've launched with Uticow, Nerdy Tenor, Brick 75, focusing on intermediate and higher level DFS strategy, hopefully teaching you how to win at a more sustainable rate without being as reliant on third-party tools and picks and advice and all of that. So check that out if you're interested. On this show, I'm not going to get into my actual lineup building or selection process, but I do have several videos up on the Endgame site going through exactly what I do to make lineups for a slate. So that type of stuff, check it out at the Endgame site. But I will talk through kind of the final result of what I would have right now. The big thing that obviously is hanging over our heads on this particular slate, and John Carlson just mentioned it in chat. He said, how are you approaching Minnesota, Chicago? That is one difference in what I did to prep for this show versus what I would have actually done if the slate were starting right now. If the slate were starting right now, based on the forecast that we have, I would have completely removed the White Sox and Twins game. It doesn't look like a good forecast at the moment. Because it hasn't been postponed and because the slate doesn't actually start right now, I went ahead and ran everything as if that game's going to go, as if we get a better forecast between now and lock. If lock were right now, I wouldn't be playing it based on how things currently look, but you guys know how weather goes. Obviously, a lot can change in the next couple of hours. So I thought it was more beneficial for the show to take a look at how I'd be handling that game if it goes as scheduled, because obviously if it doesn't go as scheduled, I'm just not playing it, and it'll bump up pitcher exposures elsewhere where I had Bailey Ober. But other than that, I thought it was more beneficial to pretend like it's going to go. But my assumption is it's not going to. If we have the same forecast now at lock, but it hasn't been postponed, I'm going to basically just cut my projections on everybody and not get that game. But hopefully the weather changes, because that is kind of an appealing game to get to. But we can start by taking a look at my pitching exposures here. And again, not going to go game by game here. If you have specific questions about how I'm handling a game, go ahead and throw them in chat. I can filter down to that game and look at how much I'm getting to it, how my lineups look, with the teams that you're interested in, all of that stuff. So throw those in chat, but I'm not going to go game by game. I'm going to go more kind of bounce around, starting with pitching, look at some stacks, look at positions. If there are really popular players that I'm not getting to, I can take a look at why I'm doing that. If I am getting to them, I'll look at what those lineups look like. How am I playing lineups that I think are plus EV and still playing really popular players? So I'm just going to kind of bounce around like that throughout the show. And we're going to start with the pitching here. Nick Lodolo showing up as my highest owned guy right now at 54%. He is coming back from the injured list, so there is some level of concern. Also, there is potential weather in this game. Right now, when I looked before the show, at least, this game looks okay, but there is still risk. So that is another forecast that I am going to be paying attention to. And obviously, especially when you're talking about pitching, if the forecast changes from it looks like the game's going to be fine to there's going to be rain in the fourth inning, then obviously I'm going to cut my projections on Lodolo and Quantrill, Lodolo being the really important one there. But for now, assuming this game is okay, it's a really good spot for Lodolo. There is obviously a little bit of elevated risk just because you have somebody coming back from the injured list. You don't know exactly what his workload is going to look like, but he missed the minimum amount of time It was a blister. So as long as he doesn't reopen the blister, he should be fine here. It wasn't an actual injury. And he's got a great matchup going up against Colorado. This is one of the worst offenses in baseball. They are outside of Coors Field. Now, hitting in Great American Ballpark is about as good as it gets outside of Coors Field, but it's still not Coors Field. The Rockies' active roster against left-handed pitching since last year has a 79 WRC plus, 26.7% K percentage. Lodolo's got a 25% K percentage this year, 3.74 xFIP. He's not expensive at 8,800. Team CJR said that game is postponed according to FanDuel. Which game? I haven't seen anything on Minnesota Chicago. It's possible I missed it. Hopefully you're not talking about the Colorado Cincy game. Clips, I specifically already said why I'm not talking about FanDuel on this show, so go away. But assuming that you're not saying the Colorado game is postponed, getting to Lodolo a lot here, and I'm perfectly fine with that. He projects for around 25% ownership, and he should. Like, he's a really good pitcher. He's underpriced for this matchup. I think whatever concerns you have about him as far as the matchup or the park or coming back from the blister, whatever, it's kind of just made up for by the fact that he's only $8,800, because generally in this spot, he is going to or should be more expensive. The KC game has been postponed. We started the day with 11. We're down to 10. We'll probably end with 9. So Lodolo looks really good. And I've mentioned it a lot on shows in the morning. I've mentioned it a lot, yesterday. I'm generally going to be differentiating more with bats than I am with pitching, because pitching only takes up one spot in my lineup, and because pitching is at least somewhat more projectable than hitting is. So I generally am going to prefer getting different there. I don't have any issue playing a 25 or 30, whatever he is, percent owned Nick Lodolo here. I'm getting to a lot of Zach Gallen as well. I don't have an issue with that. He's only getting about 18% ownership. I'm around 2x the field there. It's not the best matchup in the world against Atlanta. They do still have Ozuna, Olsen, they have Albies. They do have quality hitters still in this lineup. But when you're missing Ronald Acuna, when you're missing Michael Harris, the lineup just isn't as good as it typically is. And Gallen's only $8,900 here. He has a 26% K percentage this year, 3.29 xFIP. He's in a favorable pitcher's park in Arizona, where I assume the roof will be closed because it's like 150 degrees. So all of that sets up pretty nicely for Gallen. It is risky, but on this particular slate, there is talented pitching, but there's not really a single pitcher where you're like, okay, this guy is really good and there's no flaws with his matchup. Like Chris Sale's got a tough matchup on the other side of Gallen, and he's pretty expensive. Lodolo, who obviously I love, is in Great American Ballpark and coming back from a blister injury. There's no, perfect pitcher that doesn't have any obvious flaws on the surface. So the fact that Atlanta is still a competent offense isn't that concerning when you're talking about a pitcher as good as Gallen, especially like I was saying with Lodolo when he's only 8,900. So I'm happy to get there. Brian Bayo, I can't believe he's only getting 5% ownership. This is something that maybe there was a flaw in the ownership projections that I put in. If he's actually 5% owned, he's a great play. I assume that comes up. Like, people have been streaming pitchers against Oakland all season. Now, Oakland does have an elevated implied run total here. They do get the nice park upgrade going to Fenway Park, but this is still a team that strikes out a ton. They have the second highest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year. I understand the risks in going here because of how hitter-friendly Fenway is and the fact that Oakland does have power, but if he's really not going to get ownership, I just want to be getting to Brian Bayo. It's, I think, a pretty easy way to be different and, to be different in lineups and not really sacrifice a ton of upside. He's not the best strikeout pitcher, only about a 20.5% K percentage this year, but the matchup gives him more strikeouts. So this is a spot where I will pay attention to ownership. I would expect, if he gets up to like 10, 15% projected ownership, it's not that I would be then running away from Bayo, but my exposure to him would probably just come down to that like 10 to 15% range. Whereas with him projected at 5%, he is just jumping out as a really good play. This is something that also, when you see this happen, now that such a large percentage of the field is using Sims, when you see this happen, there's a really good chance that he's just going to be like 10 to 15% owned. Like, I might actually just manually bump that ownership after this show, because such a high percentage of the field is playing similarly to how I play that you're just going to get players doing that and playing 25%, and it's going to pull up that ownership. So even if the ownership projections don't change, this is a spot that I might just manually adjust, because I have a hard time believing that he's actually going to be 5% owned if he's showing up this well for me. But there obviously is a lot of strikeout upside there. Getting to 20% Chris Sale, getting to 20% Scherzer, both of those guys, that's around the field, makes sense. Not a good strikeout matchup for Sale, but he is the best pitcher on the slate from a talent standpoint. 32.7% K percentage, 2.45 xFIP. He's relatively expensive, but it's pretty self-explanatory why playing Chris Sale makes sense. Max Scherzer, good matchup against the Angels. There is some, concern just because this is only his fourth start back from the injured list, but I don't want to buy in too much to his strikeout percentage so far. He's only struck out 17.7% of hitters, but he's had 3 difficult matchups. He's faced the Padres, he's faced the Orioles, he's faced the Royals. Those are 3 of the bottom 7 teams in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year. He threw 90 pitches in his last start out, so we shouldn't expect any sort of real limitations on him at this point. He's got a good matchup against the Angels, 88 WRC plus on their active roster against right-handed pitching this year, middle of the pack with a 22.7% K percentage. So happy to get to Scherzer at this price. Again, it goes back to what I was saying about Gallen. There's no pitcher on this slate. While there are talented pitchers, there's no pitcher that you don't have any concerns. In Scherzer's case, the concern is we haven't seen that really good game from him yet, but you have a very long track record of who Max Scherzer is as a pitcher. And there are obvious reasons that you shouldn't be buying into the very low strikeout percentage so far this season. Like, it's insane to think that Max Scherzer is suddenly not a high strikeout guy just because he didn't get strikeouts in his first 3 starts back from the injured list against 3 of the most difficult teams to strike out. So happy to get to him. Bailey Ober showing up 16% for me. Fields at 20. It's a good spot. He's a good strikeout pitcher. Probably a complete moot point because this game's probably going to go away. But if it doesn't go away, it looks like I'll be around the field there. Now, he is somebody where if I did manually bump Bayo's ownership or ownership projection just increases on Bayo, maybe I get some more Ober because I would assume that I was giving up some Ober to get to a lower owned Bayo, considering that they do have a similar range of outcomes, even though I think Ober is the better pitcher. Same goes for Yusei Kikuchi here. He's getting 12% ownership. He showed up 12% of the time for me. If I lose some of that Bayo, if I go from like 25% down to 15%, I probably do get a little bit more Kikuchi. He looks good. It's a good park. Nice park upgrade for him in San Francisco. He's a good pitcher. 24.5% K percentage this year, 3.43 xFIP. So he's another one where I wouldn't mind if I got a little bit more right now, coming in around the field. Then you can see I'm kind of just getting to very small amounts of other guys. If you're playing less lineups, I would expect that you're probably just not getting to any of these guys. They're sort of just, last guy in type filler. Quantrill, good strikeout matchup. He's been good at limiting power this year, but he's not a very good strikeout pitcher himself. The park's not good for pitching. None of these guys down here at the bottom are guys that I can really make a strong case for. The only one that I think I could make a case for is Blanco, because he does have that good strikeout matchup against Miami, or good matchup overall against Miami. But at $10,000, when Gallen's less expensive, Lodolo's less expensive, Scherzer's less expensive, Kikuchi, Ober if that game plays, Bayo. You have all these guys that are a lot less expensive than Blanco with similar or better strikeout percentages. And the Blanco is projected for 19% ownership. I'm just not going to get there it looks like, if that ownership projection holds. And I'm perfectly fine with that because I think you get a very similar range of outcomes from those other pitchers that I mentioned that are getting similar ownership and just project as better values, allow you to get better stacks, better hitters with them because they're less expensive. If you were to flip like Bayo's ownership and Blanco's ownership, and now Blanco's 5% and Bayo's 20%, then I think Blanco becomes interesting as somebody you can just use where you have a cheap stack, the salary doesn't matter that much, and you can get a pretty good pitcher in a good spot at low ownership. But that's not how it's being projected right now. And if the field's going to overpay for Blanco instead of just taking these other guys that are very, very similar, then I'm going to take the cheaper guys. So that's why Blanco's not showing up for me right now. It is an ownership thing. Again, if that ownership were to come down, then I guess I should switch to mine. But if that ownership were going to come down, then maybe I get there. But right now, I just don't really see the point in paying that salary, paying a ceiling salary for Blanco when the ownership is already there. Looking at the stacks that I'm getting to next, overall, all stack types, getting to a lot of the Red Sox, going up against Oakland, getting to a lot of Texas, getting to a lot of Oakland. So it is interesting. I was getting to Bayo But on the other side, in non-Bayo lineups, I am also getting to Oakland. Josh Gillum said the Pirates lineup came out with no Cruz, McCutchen, or Grandal. Did they change their entire lineup? Because that lineup I thought had already come out earlier, unless maybe I was just looking at a projected lineup. Nope, you're right. It just hadn't come out. So yeah, that's an ugly Pittsburgh lineup. So getting to these three teams at the top a lot, then a step back to Cincinnati and Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh probably drops. Let me see what hitters I was actually getting to. Yeah, I was getting to O'Neal Cruz, 14%. He's apparently not in the lineup, so that's going to go away. Rowdy Tellez, I actually don't really like. I had already knocked down his projection. Maybe I need to do it a little bit more. He's cheap and has a good matchup against Colin Rea in a good park, but he's also most likely getting pinch hit for, again, depending on what that lineup looks like. Let me see if it's updated where I can see it. If anybody wants to throw that in chat, that would also help. But assuming like Connor Joe's not in the lineup, Rowdy Tellez will probably be coming out of the game, assuming they bring a lefty in against him. So yeah, we don't have Connor Joe in the lineup, so that's a right-handed bat that can pinch hit for Tellez and probably will. You'll probably see Milwaukee has several left-handed relievers. You'll probably see a lefty reliever come in to face Palacios and Tellez in the same inning if they get that opportunity. So you'll probably see Connor Joe pinch hit. You'll probably see somebody else pinch hit as well. So I do ideally want to, I think, actually have a little bit less Tellez than I do in this run because of the pinch hit risk. But anyway, getting back to the stacks, Boston, Texas, Oakland look like the three I'm getting a lot of right now. They all have high implied run totals. They all look fine. I mentioned, that I was getting to Bayo, but it's obvious that Oakland does have upside here as well. It's a huge park shift for them. They do have plenty of right-handed power. Now, Bayo generally does give up more power to lefties than to righties, but it's, it's Fenway Park. It's warm everywhere in the country. The ball should be carrying. So I like getting to both sides of that one just because of the upside that Oakland gives you in this park. Looking at their individual player ownership, not a lot coming in. So I think, you can see I'm kind of getting like 1.5 to 2x on a lot of these Oakland guys. I don't mind that at all. Langoliers at catcher gives you a lot of power upside, so that looks really good. It's a good stolen base matchup for Zach Gelof. Brian Bayo has not been good at holding runners. Gelof is the biggest stolen base threat, or has been at least so far this season for them. So I do like him a bit as a cheap second base option. Not only does he have some power, but if he gets on base, he's probably going to be running. As long as nobody's on ahead of him. Brent Rooker is the only expensive guy here, and he's got plenty of power. So Oakland gives you a relatively high upside stack just because of the park upgrade and the fact that they do have some power in their lineup. But then they're also not that popular. They're really cheap. So the lineups, the rest of your lineup around them is going to look pretty good. Like if I pull up some Oakland 5-man stacks and look at the actual lineups, Lodolo, Kikuchi, 5-man Oakland, 3-man Boston with Devers and Duran. So I'm able to afford two pitchers that I really like and get to Devers and Duran and honestly overpay for Hamilton at shortstop. He gives you upside because he's fast, but I don't love that price tag. But you're just getting, a really good 3-man Boston stack there because Oakland's so cheap. Here you have 3 one-offs, Semien, Bregman, O'Neal. They're all just, good high upside one-offs with Lodolo and Gallen, my two highest owned pitchers. Sale, Kikuchi with Garver, Polanco, Devers. So paying down for the 2-man Seattle stack, but then getting to a very expensive Devers and then Sale, Kikuchi. So you can see just like how high the ceiling is on these lineups. If you think about it in terms of, getting away from whether or not you like the Oakland hitters or whatever, getting away from that, if you just simply say, if Oakland has a good game, how do my lineups look around them? Like, am I going to be hoping that some, shitty 3K guy somehow gets like 2 doubles and a home run for the first time in his career? Or am I just going to be rooting for like some of the best hitters on the slate? And you can see that I'm rooting for some of the best hitting on the slate, some of the best one-offs and mini stacks on the slate. So really, really high upside lineups because of how cheap they are. So I do like that. And then the fact that, Bayo's not getting ownership is driving him up in my non-Oakland lineups. It's just a game environment where something like with the pricing the way it is, there's a pretty good chance that something pops. An 8K Bayo against this strikeout heavy Oakland team or a very cheap Oakland offense in Fenway Park. It's pretty likely that something comes out of that game that is really useful. So I do like getting to both sides of that one. Going back, looking at Boston, they are showing up third most in 5-man stacks, first in 4-mans, using them a lot as mini stacks as well. We take a look at what some of those Boston lineups are looking like. Ober, Gallen, so 5-man Boston, 3-man Oakland, the inverse of what we saw with Oakland before. Boston with some cheaper guys, Jake Myers and Jackson Chorio, but Corey Seager one off. Obviously that looks good. Paying down at pitcher here with Quantrill. So I think that's interesting. I'm going to assume that Boston is pretty popular, and that's why I would be getting Quantrill with them. Quantrill's not somebody, obviously, that I'm looking to get to today, but you have 19% owned Devers. You have 13% owned Wong, 12% ownership coming into Hamilton. Seager is a popular one-off. So, this is the type of lineup where if you're going to play some garbage pitcher like Cal Quantrill, it makes sense. It also makes sense because, in this lineup, I'm not getting to Cincinnati. Cincinnati is probably going to be pretty popular. They're in a good spot. So you're getting that negative correlation with a pretty popular stack. And then you're also differentiating your Boston stack that is going to be pretty popular. So not advocating for playing a lot of Quantrill, but this is the type of lineup where I think it is completely reasonable to play him. Catching up on a couple of questions. Any Washington love today? I don't know. I'm going through the slate right now. Do you get to lineups where you're stacking a whole game, 5-man one and 3-man the other? Yeah, it's not something that I force in, but I do generally get a decent amount of game stacks. There is some positive correlation in that because, obviously, if teams are playing in a favorable hitter's park, that benefits them both. If you have a favorable hitter's umpire or just an umpire having a bad day and calling a tight zone, that benefits them both. But also, if you get, let's just use the Red Sox and A's as an example, because I just showed 2 full game stacks of that one. Let's say that the Red Sox jump out to a 7-0 lead. It doesn't automatically mean that Oakland's going to score a bunch of runs, but Brian Bayo's strategy and game plan, or the starting pitcher, in this case Bayo, their game plan changes. They're not going to be out there nibbling and risking walks while they paint corners. They're going to be more willing to challenge hitters. They're not going to care if they give up that solo home run or a couple solo home runs. So you do generally, in a situation like that where one team jumps out to a big lead, you're going to see more favorable pitches to hit in general for the opposing team. You're also not going to see the best relievers coming in, and that goes both ways. Boston jumps out to a 7-0 lead. Oakland's going to go to somebody that they can just throw out there for 3 or 4 innings and hope to save the rest of their bullpen. Boston's not going to use their high leverage relievers either in that situation. So you do just get more favorable at bats throughout the game. So there is some positive correlation there. Again, it's not something that I'm forcing in, but it does naturally show up because of the positive correlation. In this case, you have the good hitters park, warm weather, all of that. So and the 2 teams in this case, specifically Boston and Oakland, they fit nicely together too. Boston's expensive, Oakland isn't. They positively correlate. So yeah, I do get the stacks like that. Yeah, since he might get delayed, just gonna have to pay attention to weather there. I don't think, at least right with the most recent forecast I looked at, Colorado Cincy does not look more scary than Minnesota Chicago. Minnesota Chicago, last I saw, probably just is not going to happen. But obviously forecasts change. Rhea or Quintana viable SP2. I think they're very similar. They are both in that Quantrill bucket. Rhea does have the better matchup going against that Pittsburgh lineup. So I think Rhea is the one that, if I just have to pick one, I would probably say Rhea. Maybe I get some of him now that, once I run things later with the actual Pittsburgh lineup. But they're all just kind of in that bucket of low strikeout guys. Rhea's in a favorable pitcher's park, or hitter's park rather. So, it's not guys that you're going to be confident in, but they all can serve this Cal Quantrill purpose in this lineup. If this was Colin Rhea or Jose Quintana, it would be the same lineup basically. So that's all fine. Tornado warnings in Cincy. Yeah, that's a new one, I guess. I hadn't seen that before the show. So obviously weather stuff right now, it's going to change. I'm not looking at forecasts at the moment. So we'll see. But none of that is particularly relevant right now. Boston called up a journeyman long reliever today, so that plays into not seeing a good relief pitcher. Yeah, that's the guy that they will throw out there if Oakland lights up Bayo, for example. They're probably just getting whoever they called up as their long guy. So that goes back to the game stacking thing. We can take a look at some of the Texas stacks also. Was getting to a lot of them. Five mans, they're showing up the most. I don't. It's a pretty good spot for Texas. It's sort of a bullpen game, but Rhodes and Contreras, I think, is stretched out enough that you're probably getting he can probably give you like 4 or so innings. It's a good park for hitting. He doesn't hold runners well, which isn't a huge benefit for Texas, but it is a benefit. Texas doesn't have one guy that has stolen a ton of bases this year. Wyatt Langford is probably eventually that guy, but he actually hasn't been running all that much this year. I think he only has 7 stolen bases. But Langford, Garcia, Semien, these guys will run at least a little bit. Leody Taveras, these guys will run at least a little bit. Contreras isn't good at holding runners. So you do get stolen base upside for Texas, which I like quite a bit. And then also, obviously, you have power upside. And they are affordably priced for the most part. A 5K price tag on Corey Seager is good. He's just more talented than that. He's hitting the ball well. And that is something, normally I don't really care how a hitter's been doing over his last few games. But I think it is worth mentioning with Seager that he's been driving the ball because he got hit on the hand. It looked, I think a lot of people assumed he broke it like a week or so ago. So the fact that he's back in the lineup and not just rolling over, hitting ground balls everywhere is good to see. So, obviously getting there. Jankowski probably has some pinch hit risk at the bottom of the order, but he is really cheap if you're rounding out a stack. Adolis Garcia has been hitting like shit lately. He is kind of the opposite of what I was saying about Seager. He's been bad, but I don't really care because his price tag's come down as a result. He's 4,500. Is today the day he breaks out of his slump? Probably not. But at 4,500, he does have power. He has speed. Hopefully, he just does some damage in this spot. Jonah Heim's cheap. Nathaniel Lowe is pretty inexpensive as well. I assume that I'm getting to some of him. Yeah, 3,700 on Lowe. So it's a high upside offense. They're reasonably priced with Seager being really the only guy that's remotely expensive. And for his talent level, he's not expensive at all. I like Wyatt Langford a lot. He gives you power. He, like I said, probably will steal more bases over the second half of the year than he did in the first half. It's a good spot for him to run here. So I did bump his projection a little bit. I like him individually quite a bit. So yeah, Texas, pretty self-explanatory. They're getting ownership. They're not getting a ton. If you look at sort of how the rest of these lineups are structured, Dominic Smith, getting 9% ownership, using Jankowski and Taveras as 2 of the lower owned Texas guys. Jonah Heim, same thing, getting the Soderstrom, Bleday as 2 more contrarian pieces. And again, the actual ownership coming into Texas, mostly around the 10% mark on most of these guys. So it's high, but it's not that high, just a benefit of a 9 or 10 game slate. So high probability stack, not that difficult to make contrarian lineups around them. Looking at this one, you have Reynolds and Palacios as very low owned Pirates. So that looks fine. Just a good team to get to, I think. Pittsburgh, I mentioned that, I was getting to them. The lineup doesn't look good. I mentioned the pinch hit risk. It is a good stolen base spot for them against Colin Reyes, so I do want to point that out. The problem is that they're another team that doesn't run a ton. O'Neal Cruz was somebody that you would expect to steal, but he's dealing with a hamstring injury. So even if he was in the lineup, I don't know if he would have run. Ke'Bryan Hayes is probably your biggest stolen base threat on this team. He's batting 5th, but Reynolds will run a little bit. There are several guys that have the ability to steal bases, even though they're not true stolen base guys. It is a good spot to run against Colin Reyes, so I did want to point that out specifically. Cincinnati, obviously the weather has been coming up a lot in chat, but assuming that game goes, they do look pretty good here. Cal Quantrill doesn't give up a lot of power, but he does give up stolen bases. Cincinnati does have guys that'll run. Ellie De La Cruz in particular, I love, especially at an 8% ownership projection. This is somebody else that I might just kind of manually bump that because I think people are just going to click Ellie De La Cruz. He's fun to play. People like him. They're aware of the upside. Kind of similar to how ownership projections on Aaron Judge this year have basically just been 10 points low no matter what. I think you probably get something 15% ownership on De La Cruz. So that's something that'll probably bump a little bit. But either way, really, really like him if the weather cooperates here. Because one, he'll run on anybody, but Quantrill doesn't hold runners well anyway. And then 2, he just sets up nicely against Quantrill. This kind of goes, Josh Gillum said, how much do you factor fly ball, ground ball pitchers into picking your stacks? I like stacking against fly ball pitchers for homers, but every batter doesn't want / can't hit homers. So yeah, there's a ton of nuance in baseball. I like getting into that stuff. There's a ton of nuance because some hitters hit different pitches well. They hit different locations well. So it's not as simple as just saying this guy gives up fly balls. You also, when you're looking at fly ball pitchers, do want to make sure that you're looking at infield fly ball percentage. A mistake that I think people make a decent amount is saying, oh, this guy is a fly ball pitcher because he has like a 48% fly ball percentage. But then you look and he has an 18% infield fly ball percentage. A pop up is just as bad as a ground ball from an offensive standpoint. It's actually worse. So that's something to pay attention to. But I do like to, and I have actually been doing it a little bit more lately, just looking at what pitch types hitters hit well against, but also what locations they hit well against. And that goes back to the point that I was going to make with Elly De La Cruz. When you just think about him and think about his swing and the type of hitter he is, and then you think about Cal Quantrill and what he's trying to do as a pitcher, he's not generating a lot of swings and misses. He's trying to keep the ball on the ground, work down in the zone. Elly De La Cruz is looking to lift balls, drive balls, and he's a big swing and miss guy against a pitcher that doesn't generate a lot of swings and misses, doesn't throw particularly hard. And then you also get this park. So everything, just pretty much every box here is checked for Elly De La Cruz, with the exception of good weather. Clip said, why do you think Oneil Cruz was better? I didn't. I just was tweeting about Elly De La Cruz constantly because last season everybody thought he was like the second coming, even though he was having a below average season. De La Cruz is a monster though. But yeah, so love him here. Candelario looks good, 4,300, good value. India will run a bit as well. Will Benson's got pinch hit risk. Probably need to lower him a little bit more than I did. Austin Slater is not starting this game. He is on the Reds. I assume he is with the team. So if you get a lefty in for Benson, then he's probably getting pinch hit for. Edwin Rios has pinch hit risk as well. 2K flat, getting 10% ownership. I think he's somebody I might end up with in cash. I don't love him in tournaments just because, again, I think it is likely that he's going to get pinch hit for. You have Santiago Espinal on the bench. He is likely, if they bring a lefty in for Rios, it's likely that you get Espinal coming in to hit, and then you get Candelario moving over to first base. So, somewhat popular Rios isn't my favorite play in tournaments, but that's not to say you can't play him. He is 2K flat. He does have a pretty good matchup against Quantrill. He does have power upside. So he's underpriced. It's just the pinch hit risk kind of scares me considering the ownership that he is getting. I do like Candelario, India, De La Cruz a lot. Stevenson at catcher looks fine as well. So yeah, Cincinnati, just looks like a pretty good team overall, but De La Cruz in particular just really, really stands out to me as far as the matchup in, against Quantrill, what Quantrill struggles with, what De La Cruz does well, kind of just all aligns. So I really like De La Cruz, which obviously isn't going out on a limb. He's really, really good. As far as other stacks go, you can see here just kind of mixing in some, most other teams. I generally do play, if I'm playing like 50 lineups or more, I do generally get pretty spread out. If I were playing 150 instead of 50, you would probably see this Boston, Texas, and Oakland start to lower, and some of these teams come up a bit. So I would get even a little bit more balanced. If I were playing less lineups, I probably would just end up a little bit more concentrated on these teams because I wouldn't be getting as far down the list. But yeah, so you can see these other, less exciting teams down here. If we look at players or hitters rather that I'm getting the most of, Devers, Blade, Wong, Seager, De La Cruz, Abreu. I think these guys are mostly self-explanatory. Really good matchup for the left-handed power on Boston. Yoshida showing up as well. Good matchup for the left-handed power on Boston going up against, I'm completely blanking on who's pitching for Oakland. Yeah. Talked about it earlier on the show this morning, but it is a good matchup for the left-handed power. Joey Estes doesn't miss a lot of bats against lefties. He's given up power so far. This park plays up right-handed power more than left-handed power, but you still just have good left-handed bats on the Red Sox. You also have pretty cheap pricing. Yoshida back in the lineup at 3,600 just looks good. Abreu is cheap. Now, one thing working against them, I think I mentioned it earlier, but in case I didn't, the A's do have 3 left-handed relievers in their bullpen, if I'm remembering correctly. Double checking that now, but yeah, they have Kyle Muller, Scott Alexander, and TJ McFarland. They all should be available today. None of them, they didn't play yesterday. So that is a concern. You do have some pinch hit risk for these guys. And even if they don't get pinch hit for, you just simply have lefty risk later in the game. So that's not ideal. But other than that, it does look really good for the Red Sox. If we look at the rest of the hitters I'm getting to, like I said, I don't think I really need to explain why I'm getting to Corey Seager or why I'm getting to. We already talked about JJ Bleday. One of the only left-handed bats that has any semblance of power on Oakland. Bayo has struggled with lefties more. Bleday can potentially run a little bit in this spot too. Semien, Yoshida, Garcia, Geloff, I already talked about. I talked about liking Langford quite a bit. So I think we've touched on all of those guys. If I sort by leverage here, we can see which players I'm getting to the most over the field. I already talked about it. I don't like Rowdy Tellez that much. I'm going to end up probably walking that back a little bit. O'Neill Cruz obviously isn't in the lineup. Brett Harris is just a function of Oakland stacks. I don't think he's a very good one-off, but he is a cheap piece that you can just throw into an Oakland stack. Third base isn't the best position today, and then you can pay up at other positions. If we look the other direction, we get Rios, the guy that I'm most under on. I talked about why that is. He's a good point per dollar value. It's just that there's a good chance you're not getting at bats later. Rafaela, don't have a real good reason for why I'm not getting to him. He has stolen base upside. He has some power. I'm getting to Boston a lot, so I don't really love that I'm not getting to Rafaela, but I'm not right now. Willie Castro, if that game plays, I actually think he's a decent play. Eric Fetty is a pretty good pitcher at this point. He's not very good at holding runners, though. I do like the stolen base spot for Castro, but I'm not getting to Minnesota much right now, and I'm not getting to Castro much, so a bit under the field there. Juan Yepez, I think, another guy kind of similar to Rios, where he has a pretty good point per dollar projection, but he does have some pinch hit risk here going up against Jose Quintana, so you're getting the righty-lefty. The Nats don't have another true first baseman on their roster, which works in Yepez's favor. But Trey Lipscomb has played first base this year. I think there's a decent chance that you would get, like if Juan Yepez is coming up in a relatively high leverage spot and there's a right-handed reliever in, I think there's a good chance that you get like Ildemaro Vargas pinch hitting for him, hitting from the left side, and then he goes into third base and Lipscomb moves to first. So there is pinch hit risk here on Juan Yepez. Yainer Diaz, just for whatever reason, not really showing up for me. Steer, I'm a little surprised I'm not getting to. He's second on Cincinnati in stolen bases, so he does get that good stolen base spot. I bumped his projection for that. He's still not really showing up. Christian Yelich, I like the spot for him quite a bit, but just not getting there right now for whatever reason, probably because he's expensive and I'm just paying up for some other guys. So, there's nothing overly interesting in the guys that I'm not getting to. Rios and Yepez, I think, are the two that were most worth talking about just because of the pinch hit risk that comes with them. Pitching wise, we already talked about not really getting to Blanco, not really getting to Rhea in the lineups I ran, or not getting to Rhea at all in the lineups I ran before. Decent chance that pops up a little bit now that we got a Pittsburgh lineup that doesn't have O'Neill Cruz or McCutchen, just a bad Pittsburgh lineup. Scrolling back through chat, biggest concern in Cincy is protecting Lodolo with any kind of delay. Yeah, I think I mentioned it at the top, but that's a game where not only do you need to pay attention to the weather as far as like, is this game going to play? But if the weather changed in a way where now you're dealing with early to mid-game rain, then you at the very least need to be knocking down Lodolo's projection, and that'll change a lot for me if I have to do that, which would suck. Hines 2K at shortstop. Yeah, he was not, I don't think, in the projected lineup I used. I can double check. I don't think, actually, no, I do think I had the Cincinnati lineup when I ran this. But he is a value play, has some speed as well. Another guy that can run against, I guess I did not have him in. Another guy that can run against Quantrill. Did Gunnar and Witt pass up Seager outright this season? I think so, but like they're all really, really good. What's my bullpen resource? I use the, what's it called? Roster. So if you go to Fangraphs and then you go to the roster resource tab, scroll down and it says 2024 closer depth chart, which is like not a descriptive title at all. I clicked it looking for something else one time and realized how useful it is. It has every relief pitcher that's active for every team, how many pitches they've thrown in each individual game that week. So you can pretty quickly see how many lefties or righties they have, how many are likely to be available that day. It's a really useful resource. Quote, don't play these guys who look good, but I'm not getting to for some reason. Yeah, the reason is that I'm only playing 50 lineups, and they didn't happen to be in the ones that I'm playing. There was my point there was sometimes I'm going to look and be like, I actually don't like this guy for this reason, kind of like Rios and Yepes. In the case of guys like Christian Yelich, if I have 10% at lock, I'm happy. I like the matchup. You are getting a lefty opening the game, which uh, is a negative for Yelich. He would be better if Quinn Priester were actually starting this game. So that's something I should have mentioned then. But you are getting the first at bat for Yelich, not against Priester, which maybe the field's not accounting for enough. But still, if I were to get to him, cool. But I'm prioritizing the other spots that I showed. Would Cincinnati play if they're under tornado watch? I don't know. Maybe. Questions about the Nats. I can take a look at if I'm getting to anything there. I think okay, so I'm not really getting to Nats bats here at all. I'm actually not getting to them at all. Reasoning would just be the park is not good for power. Quintana's not a terrible pitcher. The Nats, the middle of their lineup is cheap. The guys that I would really want, Lane Thomas and CJ Abrams, are not cheap. 176 expected ISO to righties this year for Quintana, 166 to lefties. Keeper Ruiz, 3,200, I think is fine. Lane Thomas, if you can afford him, is fine. I already talked about Juan Yepes as the best value play from the Nats, but also with pinch hit risk. So, it's not a good park for hitting home runs. It's not a pitcher that gives up a ton of power. It's not a lineup that has a ton of power. There are a lot of teams on this slate that are in good hitters parks, that have a lot of power, that are in good matchups. Not that Quintana is a horrible matchup, but it's just not a great one. So the Nats just aren't showing up for me. If you wanted to replace like Pittsburgh with Washington here, I think that's fine. But again, like even Pittsburgh is in a better park against Milwaukee. They're facing a pitcher that gives up stolen bases. So ideally, I think I would still rather get the Pittsburgh there. It's mostly a park thing, I think, and most of Washington's lineup just doesn't have a lot of power. There's just so many other spots that I'm getting to on this slate. Also, Quintana's not getting any ownership. If Quintana were somehow getting 20% ownership, then that would be pretty interesting to me. But he's not. So you're not getting a negative correlation component. You're not getting a team that projects that well. And also, with this being a 9 or 10 game slate, there's plenty of teams that are just their stacks are 5 to 10% owned. So I'm not like having to dig that far down to get to a 3 or 4% owned Nats team, for example. Einsteinium said, concerned about the Lodolo Gallon combination in tournaments. Concerned from a weather standpoint, sure. Yes, like obviously going to have to go back and look at that. Concerned from like ownership or anything like that, no. I think it's still going to be easy enough to differentiate elsewhere, and neither of those guys are getting crazy ownership. I think Gallon was projected around 20%. Lodolo was projected around 25%. You have a bunch of other pitchers getting 20 to 25% ownership as well. So pitcher ownership right now is projected to be pretty flat. My only concern, again, would be if Lodolo is going to get knocked off the mound by a tornado in the third inning, I probably need to get away from him. But aside from that, I don't really have concerns there. If there aren't any other questions, I think that covered everything. I went through pitching, hitting. I guess, if we wanted to quickly look at individual positions, Connor Wong, Jonah Heim, Raleigh, Langoliers, my highest owned catchers. Getting to Dominic Smith, Candelario, Tellez, Soderstrom at first base. Again, I don't really like Tellez. I'll probably knock that down a little bit. Also, he probably would just go away too, because part of the reason I would be getting to him is because he positively correlated with O'Neill Cruz. So that's not happening anymore. Semien, Geloff, who I like individually. Altuve, good stolen base spot for him too. Forgot to mention with Houston, Rogers, despite being left-handed, not great at holding runners, so looks good for him. Getting to some India. Third base should hopefully be Rafael Devers a lot. Yeah, Devers, Smith. Using that Brett Harris punt, I would assume that a lot of Brett Harris is in Oakland stacks. I would hope it's in Oakland stacks. That's not the kind of guy that I really want as a one-off because he doesn't give you a ton of power upside. Shortstop should be Ellie De La Cruz right now. Yeah, Cruz, De La Cruz, and Seager. Obviously, O'Neill Cruz went away. De La Cruz might be going away depending on that weather. Seager, I think, is probably here to stay. The other big takeaway is shortstop sucks. I understand, I guess, why $4,700 David Hamilton's getting 12% ownership because I don't want to play any of these guys other than like these two. Outfield, I think it's a lot of the Boston guys that are cheap, Yoshida and Abreu. JJ Bleday gives you upside and is cheap. Then getting to the Texas guys. So nothing too surprising there. Pretty much outfielders from my stacks, but also just high upside guys. TTID Forever said, I did my customary 8 lineups, have Ray in 4, along with Sale in nearly all of them. Are you concerned about Ray? I mean, I'm concerned because he's not very good. He does have a good matchup. It's another spot where, like, if you're happy with your lineups, I wouldn't redo them just to get away from Colin Rea. But just understand you're taking on a lot of risk because he's not very good. He's in a hitter's park rather. He does have a pretty good matchup against the watered down Pittsburgh lineup. Doesn't get a lot of strikeouts on his own. Pittsburgh does give you some strikeouts. He doesn't hold runners well. Pittsburgh has a bunch of guys that kind of will steal bases. So like I think he's fine. I think I probably do end up with more at lock than I had for this show since we got the Pittsburgh lineup. But I think it's just you have to understand you're taking on risk. He is cheap. You're probably getting really good lineups around him. And also, like if you're not playing Lodolo because of weather, in my case, that would open up a bunch of exposure that maybe turns into Colin Rea. So I think he's fine. But if you're asking, am I concerned about him? Yeah, he's not a very good pitcher. But I wouldn't like redo my lineups. Let me see how I have him projected. This is before we got the Pittsburgh lineup. So Rea's projection will most likely be higher later for me. But no, I have him projected quite a bit above Quintana. He looks like a good value here. I think probably the reason I wasn't getting to him was one, that he is getting some ownership around like 10 to 11%. And then at the time, I had O'Neal Cruz and McCutchen projected in, so the lineup didn't look as good. And I was also getting to those Pittsburgh guys against him in that park. So I think it all kind of just like worked to kick Colin Rea out of my lineups. But yeah, I think he looks like, from a projection standpoint, probably the best 7,400. Yeah, like I think he's the best projected sub 8K pitcher. So, not a ton of confidence again because of his talent level, but it's fine. Yeah, so I think that's all I have for you on this show. Thanks for checking it out. We'll be back with the same 2 shows again tomorrow. Actually, assuming that we have a night slate tomorrow. I don't know. Maybe we have that weird Wednesday thing and I would only have a morning show. I'll be back at the normal time slots if there is a night slate tomorrow, 11 a.m. and 5 p.m. If there's not a night slate, then I'll just be back with the morning show. But thanks for checking it out and good luck on your lineups tonight.